Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another video. As with the previous Pulp Fiction video, this is a video breakdown of experimental narrative and the use of experimental or non-traditional or non-conventional narrative devices in Pulp Fiction. So this PowerPoint and this lesson and this video are designed to help specifically A-level film students in year 13 who are sitting the EDUQAS WJEC Component 2 paper. So it's Component 2 Section D film movements, and it deals with experimental cinema. And this video will cover the experimental narrative of Pulp Fiction. So just to start us off, so a bit of exam context. On screen you can see previous exam questions that have been set by the exam boards. And remember, in the exam you only have to answer one of the two questions. Pick one of the two. The keyword is either or on the screen. Okay, so question 1. Explore how far your film or films are. Explore how far your chosen film or films are experimental in challenging conventional approaches to narrative. So again, the keyword is experimental, and it says challenging conventional approaches. So as I explained in the last video, this is a bit of a synoptic module. So you need to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of how Tarantino rejects, subverts, challenges, experiments with all of the narrative devices that you've learnt about and studied and written about on the previous films, specifically for Component 1, Section C, English cinema, or British cinema rather. So your job is to show how this is experimental, and you must focus analysis on experimental narrative. Now that's a bit easier for this film than Auteur because everything about this narrative is experimental, whereas the Auteur students can find themselves losing marks because they talk about Tarantino's Auteur status, but they don't frame it as experimental or focus on the experimental nature of his work. So let's get into it. So before we start, let's look at a few key terms. Temporality is a word that you're going to have to use in your essay, and maybe spatiality. But temporality, narrative time, the time across which a narrative takes place. In linear narratives, time is linear and it's presented and ordered in a linear fashion. So a key aspect of narrative is the manipulation of time and space. And in the linear narrative, time is linear and the space in which the film takes place is clearly established and made clear. However, that's not really true of Pulp Fiction. So think about time. Tarantino does manipulate time and space. That's what filmmakers do with narrative, but he does it in a much more experimental, non-linear way. So at the top of our heads, we can start with a few general points about the film that you might want to think about or focus on in your analysis. You can talk about this in your intro. This lesson looks at specific narrative devices and how Tarantino experiments with it, but the broader top-down view of how this film is experimental is it uses non-linear narratives, episodic, so it's like 3 episodes in one story, isn't it? We have title cards. We don't really have a single protagonist. The function of dialogue in the narrative is very interesting. It's not about narrative exposition, it's more about character development. So we've got all these different things going on that you could talk about and reference in the essay, but what we're going to look at in this video is some quite specific uses of, subversions and experiments with traditional narrative approaches. Okay, so let's define nonlinear first of all. Okay, so nonlinear narrative is in storytelling is a process of revealing the story, not by showing the events happening chronologically, so chronologically in a linear time, but rather in a non-linear order, but by revealing events in a way that carefully controls information that the audience receives. The dramatic revelations are completely in the hands of the screenwriter, who carefully manipulates the audience by choosing not only what facts to reveal, but when to reveal the most important elements of the story. In this way, the writer gives the audience specifically chosen pieces of the picture like a jigsaw puzzle until the final story is revealed when the last piece is in place. So that's very different from a linear narrative, where in a linear narrative, we can a challenge or some sort of conflict is established pretty early on, and that creates a goal. And that goal is what motivates the characters and drives the narrative. So when you realize, or when the goal is introduced in a linear narrative, most audience members can predict the ending, can't they? Because the film will end when that, or the narrative rather, will end when that goal has been resolved and met. So linear narratives effectively run on a system of cause and effect, binary opposition, and goal orientation. Now, those things do appear in Pulp Fiction, but they do not function in the same way as in a linear narrative. They are subverted or experimented with, and that's what this essay this video is going to try and cover, and your essay should try to express in the exam. Okay, so Pulp Fiction's narrative structure is one of the film's most experimental elements. I mean, if there's one or two key signifiers of Tarantino's signature features in his oeuvre, it is experimentation with time and space, isn't it? And his non-linear narrative and the order in which information is presented. Christopher Nolan as well is another modern auteur who's very much defined by his manipulation of time and space. But Tarantino, I think, goes like much further with it, and it's much more obvious in his work. Okay, so when structuring his film, Tarantino rejected conventional approaches to narrative, subverting audience expectation and reinforcing the film's postmodern or experimental status. I'll just stress, I don't really refer to Tarantino's QT in the real world, but for brevity, QT refers to Quentin Tarantino in this PowerPoint. So to answer the question, you have to continually refer back to traditional approaches to narrative and explain the ways in which Tarantino subverts or rejects them. So it's not enough to say it's non-linear and it's episodic, and those points are made at the start. They're very, I'd say, basic and very surface level. Now, you can focus on those and get a relatively good mark in the exam, but I would argue that if you really want to show a sophisticated and quite excellent knowledge and understanding, which is what's required for a Band 5A or A-star answer, you need to show a real understanding of traditional narrative and conventional narrative, and then how Tarantino subverts it. And that's how I'm going to approach this video. So let's get into it. So, in linear traditional narratives, non-experimental linear narratives, the modes are linear and goals are created which drive the narrative. So most linear narratives are goal-orientated, rely on binary opposition. So anyone doing the film studies course will know what all these things are because you've studied British cinema, binary oppositions. There's existing recognizable structures, so part of narrative also encapsulates like genre effectively and representation. So narrative is a very broad topic, and we can bring those things into a narrative study and usually work towards a clearly defined resolution, and they all lived happily ever after. So hopefully, if you've seen Pulp Fiction, even if you don't quite understand narrative or not sure what to think about this film, we understand that those things are probably not operating in the same way in Pulp Fiction as they would in, let's say, a more conventional film like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, whatever. So, goal-orientated narratives. Okay, so Pulp Fiction does in fact have a goals in the film, but is the narrative itself orientated by a goal? So traditional narrative construction effectively runs under the principle a goal is established and all that goal motivates characters, and every single element of the narrative is in service to that goal moving forward. And once the goal is established, the narrative is resolved. So there are goals in Pulp Fiction, but are they in service of the narrative or something else, as in narrative development? Do those goals, when they're met, bring us closer to narrative resolution? We would argue, well, maybe not. Okay, so for example, the two characters on the left, Vincent and Jules, they have a goal, don't they? And their goal, ostensibly, is to retrieve the briefcase and return it to Marcellus Wallace. Okay, so that goal is established very early on. Fantastic. Ticks all the linear boxes. But then the goal is met almost instantly. In like the second or third scene in the film, they achieve their goal. So in a linear narrative, that goal will be resolved at the end of a narrative. But the fact it's resolved straight away means, well, how do we explain the rest of the film, the narrative, and how and why does it make sense? So the goals are important to the characters, and they develop the characters, but the goals of each character do not drive the narrative or bring us closer to resolution. So the key point to understand for goal orientation is that Tarantino does use goals in his film, but he does not use it to drive narrative development. He uses it to drive character development, and that's something we're going to build upon in this essay. So the reason the goals are important to the spectator in the audience is because they are important to the characters. Now, whether Vincent and Jules retrieve the suitcase is largely irrelevant. It's a bit of a MacGuffin, isn't it? We as an audience don't really care about that because we're never told what's inside it. So what matters is that goal of the briefcase allows us to spend time with the characters and develop the characters in the narrative, and that is what we're going to argue is really giving the narrative structure. It's not a goal, it's the characters. So the goal of each character does not drive the narrative or bring us closer to resolution. So Tarantino experiments with the classical narrative device of goal orientation. Instead of using a goal to drive a narrative towards resolution, he uses goals to motivate characters and their actions. So the nonlinear narrative, so for example, our evidence in the film, the nonlinear narrative is resolved only halfway through their story. So they have retrieved the briefcase, but they have yet to return it to Marcellus. But the narrative ends as they are on the way to complete that goal. So we can't say with certainty or confidence that the goal drives the narrative, develops the characters, but it does not give the narrative coherence, or it does not act as connective tissue in the narrative the same way as in a linear narrative. So clearly defined resolution. Linear narratives are driven by a goal, and that goal leads to a clearly defined resolution. So think of films, Luke Skywalker goal, save his father, the Empire collapses, they all live happily ever after. A clearly identified goal and a clearly defined resolution until Disney bought it, but that's another question. So what type of resolutions do we see in Pulp Fiction? The journey and story of most of the central characters are resolved. Butch, his goal is to escape town, and he does ride off into the sunset and live a life of luxury. Marcellus, he does forgive the sins of Butch, lets go of his hatred and vengeance. And Jules experiences a miracle, and he leaves crime and walks the earth like Kane from Kung Fu. So the narrative ends with the middle of Jules and Vincent's story, but there's no resolution to the overall narrative itself. The narrative is circular without beginning and end. So although, and this point about Butch, Marcellus, and Jules, I'll come back to this later, but the idea is that those characters meet their goals, but they're in the film after that. So when we do see some of the characters hypothetically walk off to the sunset, we may see them again afterwards. We see some characters dead after alive. So the point is that their goals and the resolution of the individual chapters does not actually lead to the resolution of the narrative as a whole. So we can't, with evidence, say a clearly defined resolution is what is driving the narrative, and it is achieved by all characters. So he experiments with that. Okay, binary opposition. Okay, so binary opposition, as we know, opposing forces that when in conflict drive the narrative forward. So I don't know why I always come back to this example, but if there's no Doc Ock, then Spider-Man has no motivation to get up and put his suit on. There's a film there about Spider-Man sitting on his couch. So we need the binary opposition, and when the one binary opposition, like when evil, for example, is defeated or removed from the narrative by good, the narrative resolves very, very quickly, doesn't it? But that's not the case in Pulp Fiction. Okay, so the point is traditional narrative devices like goal orientation, binary opposition, a clearly defined resolution usually function as connective tissue. They give a linear narrative a sense of cohesion and coherence, but they do not work that way in Pulp Fiction. So, binary opposition in Pulp Fiction. Okay, so the devices are not used as connective tissue. They do not give the narrative form and coherence. Rather, they allow for greater character development and exploration of the film's themes. I'm just going to try and turn the camera off. Okay. Okay, so the binary oppositions do motivate the characters, and they do provide insight into the characters, and they develop the characters' journeys and the characters themselves, but they do not contribute to the narrative resolution of the film or give the narrative cohesion or form. That comes from something else. Okay, so to end this section of the video, Tarantino does use a lot of the traditional, conventional narrative devices and techniques, but he does not use them in the traditional sense. He subverts or experiments with them. So those devices are not in service of narrative development, they're in service of character development, and that's something we're going to come on to in the second part of the video. Okay, so what are the consequences of not adopting a nonlinear narrative? Okay, traditional narrative devices and approaches are subverted. Binary oppositions and goals, clear resolutions are used to develop characters. They are not in service to the narrative structure of the film. Nonlinear chronology encourages deeper spectatorship and spectator engagement. So an example of this is a lot of linear narratives try to they use enigma codes and action codes, yes, but they generally try to keep the audience informed of what's going on, and they generally do not want to end a narrative with an open enigma code, so a question that's not been answered. So linear narratives try and tick all the boxes and make sure the audience leave the cinema with a really clear understanding of what's happened and why. Otherwise, the film doesn't make sense. So an example of where Tarantino experiments with that and this idea of active spectatorship and more experimental postmodern filmmaking is the briefcase. So I always ask the class, what's in the briefcase? we get several answers. Some people say it is gold, it's money, it's weapons, it's diamonds, it's jewels. Some people argue it is the actual soul of Marcellus Wallace. The point is, they are all correct and incorrect at the same time. It's an unknown. So we as spectators, we start to become producers of meaning within this narrative, and that's a very postmodern approach. Okay, so temporality and spatiality, also time and space, are much harder to establish, as time is shown to be passing in a non-chronological manner. And I know the film is set in Los Angeles, but we don't establish like space and narrative space in the same way a film like, say, Fast and Furious would, which is very clearly defined where everything is in relation to each other. This film's a bit more nebulous in that sense. Okay, and without a specific time and space for the narrative to sit within, it becomes harder to link the film to external issues, and it all contributes to the creation of what we call a hyper-reality. Okay, so now that we have addressed some of the ways Tarantino subverts and experiments with traditional narrative devices, we need to think, well, how and why does this film make sense? What gives the narrative coherence and cohesion if those traditional narrative devices are being subverted? Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is dialogue. So dialogue, obviously, the spoken words of characters. And the dialogue in this film is really, really important. So a lot of the time in linear films, dialogue, and this is why it's so difficult to write linear film, is that the dialogue has to operate on several levels at once. The first level, it has to provide exposition. It has to tell the audience what's happening and why. But also it has to sound naturalistic and develop characters. So I'm not going to show the clip now, but if you want a really good counterpoint to understand the difference between dialogue in linear and non-linear narratives, I strongly recommend you search a scene called Fast and Furious 7 Road Wars. And there's a conversation between Vin Diesel and Michelle Rodriguez's character as they go to Road Wars. And all the dialogue, it's meant to feel natural, but it's all questions. Where are we going? Why are we going there? What's our relation to it? What's the context of this place and what do we hope to achieve? Now, that conversation is really unnatural, but its service to the narrative is exposition. It's giving exposition to the audience so we understand what's going on. It makes the narrative coherent, i.e. it makes it understandable. Now we know why the characters are doing what they're doing, where they're going, why they're going, what they hope to achieve. Okay, dialogue doesn't work like that in Pulp Fiction, so I suggest you watch the Fast and Furious tape and then directly watch the Royale with Cheese conversation from the start of Pulp Fiction, and you learn nothing about the narrative in that sequence. You don't know where they're going. You don't know why they're going there. You don't learn that they're hitmen. You don't really learn anything about the narrative, but you learn a lot about the characters. So the dialogue is what we're going to call its connective tissue. The dialogue itself gives the film cohesion and coherence, and we'll explain that as we go through. So, in the absence of a goal, how does Tarantino drive the narrative forward and connect the events so the film makes sense? And one way they do that is the conversations between the characters. So initially, the dialogue, it's not expositional for narrative, but it does develop characters. We learn loads about Vincent and Jules and their attitudes to the world and the differences simply by their conversation about their food preferences and how they perceive America versus Europe. We learn a lot about the characters, but nothing about the goals. They literally don't say. Okay. So, without goals, the non-linear narrative of Pulp Fiction must use another method to build connections between scenes. This is achieved through dialogue, character development, and themes. So, if we watch the Royale with Cheese sequence, but more specifically the scene in Pulp Fiction, where, as shown on screen, where Vincent and Jules are walking towards the apartment, they have a long conversation that some people may argue is meaningless, i.e., it doesn't contribute to narrative. It's a real well-written scene, but it's not telling us anything about the narrative or the goals. But another way to look at it is the conversation establishes several really important points that will come back later, which will make later scenes make sense. So, for example, we learn some really important information. For example, we learn that Vincent is taking Marcellus's wife on a meeting, like a night out, that Vincent is not sure whether it's a date or he's not quite sure how to sort of frame it. We also learn that Vincent views a foot massage as an erotic encounter and Jules does not. We also learn that the last man who gave his wife a foot massage or got intimate or seemingly got intimate with Marcellus's wife, Tony Rocket Horror, was thrown off a balcony and left paralyzed. So that may seem like irrelevant information, but later on, the film makes sense because of that. Okay, so that's how the dialogue connects scenes, not a goal. Okay, so the language is lowbrow. The conversation seems meaningless. In a linear narrative, this scene does not contribute to narrative progression. So you don't see scenes like this in the linear narratives because ultimately they're not contributing to anything in terms of narrative, so they're not there. Filmer is very efficient. So, however, in nonlinear narratives, the conversations act as connective tissue between sequences and they give the narrative form and coherence. We find out that Marcellus may have killed Tony after he gave the foot massage. We also find out Vincent sees a foot massage as an erotic encounter. So, the only reason we understand what happens later, or one of the main reasons, is this conversation. But also, we find out Vincent finds the foot massage erotic. That then explains and helps us understand why he's having a conversation in the mirror. Should I do it? Should I not do it? Now, while he's having that conversation, that allows Mia to take the drugs to have an overdose. So that sequence makes sense because of what happened in this scene, the dialogue. It's not a goal. It's not a binary opposition. It's not anything to do with linear narrative construction. It's a non-linear technique. Okay, so we are using dialogue. We're experimenting with dialogue to give narrative form and coherence, and that is why one of the many reasons why the narrative is so experimental. Okay, if you want another example, I would encourage you to watch the scene where Vincent goes to Lance's house to buy the drugs, and then think about how does the dialogue, which seems irrelevant in that scene, set up and help us understand things later on. How does it connect? The connective tissue, how does it connect? Okay, so what we learn about the scene, what we learn about the characters rather, in Lance's house are the following. There's needles in the house. We learn that. We learn the heroin is usually stored in a balloon, but Vincent takes it home in a plastic bag, which is usually used for cocaine. We learn that the heroin Vincent is taking is extra strong. Okay, so we learn that someone keyed Vincent's car. We learn that Vincent is a heroin addict. Okay, so how does this set up later on, and how does this create a narrative cohesion on coherence later on? Okay, so we now understand why Vincent takes Mia after she overdoses to Lance's house. Okay, they've got adrenaline and needles in the house. We now understand why Mia has an overdose. She mistakes heroin for cocaine. So the reason we know that is because, as we've already been told, heroin is usually stored in a balloon, but he takes it in a plastic bag, which is used for cocaine. So we now understand why Mia mistakes heroin for cocaine. Okay. Okay, so with the car, it's never explicitly stated in the film, but that car, it's suggested by Tarantino that was Butch. So we now, if you read, extra textual information, you now understand that. And we also understand Vincent, heroin addict. We now start to understand, if you know about heroin addiction, why Vincent is on the toilet quite a lot, and that explains why he's in the toilet when he should be standing guard with a machine gun, is because it gives you diarrhea. Okay, so the point is, the dialogue is functioning as connective tissue. The conversations develop character, but they also give the narrative coherence and form. They don't develop narrative, but they make it coherent and understandable. This is how nonlinear narratives make sense. It's through those really sophisticated links in dialogue. Okay, so a second method Tarantino uses in nonlinear narratives to give it form and coherence are the themes. So the characters in a linear narrative, a character exits the narrative when their goal has been met. Okay, Obi-Wan Kenobi's goal in Star Wars is to tell Luke he's a Jedi, give him the lightsaber, and get him on board the Death Star. So he dies because he's narratively defunct as a character. In Pulp Fiction, it's different. Okay, so Jules and Vincent meet their goals pretty early on. However, they stay in the film, but Vincent does exit. Sorry, Jules does exit the narrative, but Vincent doesn't. So we're going to have a think about that. Okay, so if you look at the three scenes, the three episodes, Vincent and Mia, Butch and Marcellus, Jules, all three of our main characters or groups of characters have a moral decision presented to them. Okay, so Butch and Marcellus Butch has a decision to make. Do I go back and do I help Marcellus, even though he wants to kill me, or do I leave him to be sexually abused by Zed? Butch makes what I think most people would argue is the right decision. He makes the right moral decision, and he saves Marcellus. Marcellus then has a choice to make. Does he murder Butch? Because, number one, Butch betrayed him, and secondly, Butch is the only living witness to his sexual assault. So there is a motivation for someone like Marcellus to kill Butch, but he doesn't. He chooses the right decision. He lets him go. So he forgives him. Later on, Jules has a decision. Is he going to continue his life of crime? Is he going to walk the earth like Kung Fu, Kane from Kung Fu? So he decides to walk the earth. Vincent never has that, is never able to make that decision. Okay, so Vincent does not develop as a character. Okay, so the plot lines of Jules and Butch are resolved from and the characters are then removed from the narrative. Okay, but they're not removed at the end of the film. They're removed midway through. Okay, but then they're given a resolution because they both experience life-changing moments. They both have moral decisions to make. The moral decision leads to redemption, and their role in the narrative ends when their plot lines are resolved. Vincent is different, though. Vincent does not have an opportunity to make the decision. It's robbed of him because of his own addiction. So when Vincent is in the mirror, should I sleep with Mia or should I go home? If he would have stayed in that scene and made the decision to go home, we'd argue that he develops as a character, he moves it forward, and therefore would be redeem himself. But because he is not able to act on it, he never redeems himself. So that's why Vincent is stuck in this loop. So if you think about the narrative, when the film ends, Jules literally walks off into the sunset, but we never see him again. Because when Vincent is murdered by Butch, that takes place the day after the scene in the bar. Okay, so Jules should be there, but he redeemed himself, so he's removed from the narrative. His theme, his redemption is complete. Vincent is then never redeemed, therefore he is doomed to live a literal cycle of life and death, because when the narrative ends in the film, Jules and Vincent are going to give the briefcase back. Jules goes his own way, Vincent then goes home. The next day, he gets shot, okay? But then the next time we see him, he's back at the start of the film, so he's trapped. So he is not able to leave the narrative where the other characters are. Okay, so summary. The nonlinear narrative of Pulp Fiction rejects traditional narrative devices such as goal orientation and relies on character development, dialogue, and themes to connect the seemingly disconnected sequences. The conversation between characters seem meaningless, but they act as a connective tissue between scenes, giving the narrative form and coherence. Resolving the narrative of the film with Jules' actions in the cafe completes his redemption, and in doing so, the narrative. Both Jules and Butch live happily ever after, but Vincent remains alive because he has not achieved redemption. The nonlinear narrative of Pulp Fiction is given coherence and form through dialogue that links scenes together. The character arcs are the primary driver of narrative. This is a postmodern trait as it rejects traditional modes of cinema. So, hopefully, what I've talked about will give you at least a framework to answer this question: how far your chosen film or films, Pulp Fiction, are experimental in challenging conventional approaches to narrative. So hopefully that's helped a little bit. Now, obviously, for students who are in my class using this is only half the story. You have to fill in the rest of this with examples, analysis, and develop these ideas. And there are other avenues from which you can attack this essay. For example, what I said at the start. However, these are what I think are relatively it's quite a sophisticated way to break the film down, I think, to avoid basic points like using nonlinear narrative. We've gone into real depth on it. So I'd encourage you to revise this session, use it to inform your essay plan, and also if there's any comments, feedback, or any suggestions, or any other narrative points that I've missed or overlooked, please put them in the comments. But hopefully this helps. And a final point, I will do another Pulp Fiction video, probably on cinematography and its experimental use of cinematography in the next few days, but hopefully this is useful.